Hey guys, Alan Saylor with the Nature Center here. And for Lunch Bunch today, I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about freshwater mussels. What better way to spend lunchtime than talking about an animal that's actually really good to eat as well? But like a lot of animals that aren't cute and cuddly, mussels are probably one that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. In fact, most of the time when we see mussels, we're probably just seeing them as the broken, eroded shells that line the beach, right? Anytime you go to a lake or a pond or a river, you might see hundreds of these little shells. We don't really think too much, though, about the animal that used to be inside of that shell. So we're going to answer a couple questions about mussels today that a lot of people have because, again, they just probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking about mussels unless they look like this, right? Which is certainly how I like to see mussels from time to time. I'm a big seafood fan, so mussels can be good to eat, but they're also very important for their ecosystem as well. So let's start with a couple of those questions. First of all, how do mussels move? So whenever we see a clam or anything like that, like a bivalve, a shellfish, we don't really think about them moving very much, right? And in reality, they don't a lot because they kind of like to stay in one spot, right? They're what's called a sessile organism or a sedentary organism, right? But mussels do get around on their own if they have to, and the way they do that is with their foot. So if you're taking a look at this mussel and asking yourself, I don't see any feet on that thing, you're right, okay? But you probably have guessed that the foot is actually on the inside of the creature. So if you pick a mussel up while it's still alive, it's probably going to be really tightly shut because they do have they're very muscular, they're very strong. They keep that shell closed to avoid predators. But if you do open it up a little bit, you're going to see something like that looking back at you. So what that is it's the muscular foot of the mussel. So to look inside a mussel, you kind of see there's a lot more going on than just it being kind of a little blob in a shell, right? Not only do they have that foot, they also have a digestive system, a heart, a mouth, obviously. They've got gills, they've got siphons. There's a lot going on in there, but that foot is the part that they'll actually stick out of their shell and kind of use it to grab onto things and pull themselves a little bit. The foot also serves a second important purpose. It doesn't just help the mussel get around from place to place, it also helps it anchor into place when it needs to. If the mussel were to get washed downstream or something like that, whenever they find a new spot on the riverbed, on the substrate, the stuff at the bottom of the river, they'll use that foot to kind of push their way into the ground. You can kind of see there in this picture that they use the foot and expand it to move that sand and gravel or whatever's there out of the way so they can scooch themselves further down into the ground. It takes larger mussels, maybe anywhere from a few hours to a day or two to completely bury themselves into the riverbed. But smaller mussels can do it pretty quickly. You can see here, these are a couple of mussels that are actually disappearing right before your very eyes into a sandy beach. It's really kind of strange to see them actually move when we've never actually seen a shellfish move before. So it's really kind of cool to see them go. They just kind of turn themselves up and turn themselves upside down basically, and then just start shooting right down into the sand with the strength of that really muscular foot. It's very strange to see them go. Sometimes you can see this at a seafood counter too, because a lot of the mussels that are caught and sold are actually sold while they're still alive. So sometimes you might be able to see things like mussels or other shellfish like clams kind of moving around using that foot. So that's how mussels move. Now, what do they eat? That's another good question, right? If you're not moving around a lot, you kind of have to have your food come to you. So what mussels do is something called filter feeding. If you look at this mussel anatomy again, you're going to notice at the back end of the mussel, there's two things called siphons. Okay, there is an inhalant siphon, so that's where water comes in. There's an exhalant siphon where water goes out. So basically what happens is water flows into the mussel as they're stuck in the bottom of the riverbed, and then all the particles and things that are inside that water are going to get caught up in the mussel's gills. It's not only how they breathe, but it also helps them feed. Okay, so the mussel, everything gets caught in the gills is going to get slowly pushed towards the mouth of that mussel. So there you can see there's all sorts of stuff in the water, right? Things like bacteria, things like algae, detritus, right? Little bits of decomposing things are flowing in the water, and then they're going to get sucked in by the mussel and pushed towards that little cotton ball shaped digestive gland so that the mussel can then eat it, right? So they're taking in lots and lots of water to feed. A full-size adult mussel, which can be pretty big. Some of the ones we have in Kansas, when they're fully grown, when they're fully mature, are about the size of the palm of your hand, right? So these aren't tiny little things. They're a pretty good size. They will be able to go through about a 5-gallon bucket's worth of water every single day. So if you combine all that together and think about tens of thousands of mussels along a river, okay, or a little patch of riverbed, how much they're pumping that water through their body and cleaning it up, it adds up to be a pretty huge impact on the quality of the water. You can take a look at this video. They actually do a time lapse of 2 aquariums, right? So you have one that is full of mussels and one that's completely empty. Let's take a look and see how quickly these mussels can actually clean that water. You can see there's a lot of movement, a lot of activity going on in the mussel aquarium. It's really kind of impressive. After just about 30 minutes, you can already start to see the water quality start to improve. It becomes less turbid, becomes more clear. And they keep going. So after about a full hour or so, that group of mussels will have almost completely filtered through that 10-gallon tank, that 10-gallon aquarium. So they're really, really good at cleaning up. And all that bacteria, all that algae, all the stuff they're taking out of the water, if there was too much of it in the stream, that could be harmful to things like fish, to frogs, to turtles, to everything else in that stream ecosystem. So mussels play a really, really important role just by existing, just by eating, and keeping the water clean. All right, so how do mussels disperse? Now, this is a cool thing, okay? So obviously, an organism that doesn't move around a lot has to have a way to get their young out into the world, right? Like a tree has seeds, okay? A mussel spreads its young out as well, and in some pretty creative ways. So this is the way they end up taking over ponds and rivers and things like that is by using their glochidia. So what a glochidia is, or a glochidium would be the singular, those are basically a larva of a mussel. Okay, this is a cross-section. You can see this is a fish's gill. And what they do is they will release these tiny glochidia into the water, and they will actually become parasites on these fish. So fish play a hugely important role in the way that mussels reproduce. Because they spend the early part of their life as a parasite instead of a filter feeder, they have to find a fish to clamp onto and hitch a ride on. Otherwise, they can't survive. So a lot of different mussels rely on different host fish. Some of them will rely on really tiny fish like darters and shiners. Others rely on pretty big fish like bass or drum, things like that. These are a picture of some of those host fish that they might attach to. They can range from really tiny to really pretty large. And they will try and attach themselves to the gills and fins until they'll feed off the fish until the glochidia are large enough to fall off and start really growing their shell. And then several years later, they become a full-size mussel. So obviously, if they rely so heavily on the fish as part of their reproductive process, they have to come up with some pretty creative ways to fool those fish into taking up the parasite, right? Because no animal wants to be parasitized. They don't want to be infected with another living thing. So there's some pretty creative evolution here, some pretty interesting things, some adaptations that have popped up in the world of freshwater mussels. So if we were to look at this is something called a conglutinate. Okay, it is one of the ways that mussels infect their host with their young. So those strange little gummy worm looking things are actually produced by something called a western fan shell. That's one of the mussel species that we have here in Kansas. And those little worms that they release, if you zoom in on them really closely, you see that they're actually composed of tiny larval mussels. They're basically a mass of tiny eggs that hatch into little glochidia, right? So these will be released by the fan shell. They'll kind of wriggle around in the current and hoping that a fish will come and snap it up. And once they do, they've suddenly released all these tiny little mussels that will get their hooks into the fish any way they can. So it's kind of a Trojan horse almost to try and sneak those young mussels into their prey. And they don't just look worm-like. Some of them are pretty highly evolved as a trick. This is from a kidney shell mussel, and you can see that these conglutinates, again, these are released by the mussel. They're put out there to flap around and hopefully get snapped up by a fish. These look almost exactly like fish themselves. Okay, they put up a pretty good impression of a fish. They've even got little eye spots on them. And again, This isn't a living thing on its own. It's really just like a sack for the young to be carried from one place to another and hopefully eaten by its host fish. Other mussels have something called marsupial gills. So that means they'll actually put their young into the gill on the edge of their shell. And they can use these gills as a little bit of a lure, hoping that a fish will come along and bite them. So this is a plain pocketbook mussel, and you can see here when they start flapping those gills, once they have young that they're trying to disperse, they can start flapping those gills, and it looks quite a bit like one of the little darters or minnows that's swimming around it. It's even got the little eye spot and the little tail fin going too. So it's a really good imitation, hoping that something probably a little bit larger like a bass might come and try and snap that up. And let's go for one more question here. Can you eat Kansas mussels, right? Yes and no, right? So a lot of the Kansas freshwater mussels, they're edible, but they might not be palatable to you. They actually produce a compound called putrescine, and just by the sound of that word, you can kind of tell that no, it doesn't sound like it's going to be a very fun thing to eat. It is a compound that kind of concentrates on the mussels, and it does kind of serve as like a predator defense. It doesn't smell very good, doesn't taste very good. So the mussels themselves are probably not something tasty to eat. Now, mussels have been eaten for a long time here in Kansas. They actually have found some archaeological sites along some of the rivers here in the state that look like they contain what were mussel cook sites. So some of the first peoples of Kansas would collect mussels and would cook them with things like wild onion in order to make them a little bit more palatable. So And mussels have been eaten here before, but it probably wouldn't be a good thing to eat them today, especially if you consider that mussels live a very long time. So it's not uncommon for some of the mussels we have here to live 40, 50, 60 years, some of the species. And if you think about that, that's a long time for them to be filtering water. And sometimes they're not just taking bacteria and algae out of the water, they're also exposing themselves to things like heavy metals, pesticides, some other stuff, right? So they're taking a lot of things out of the water that we wouldn't want to be eating anyway. So unfortunately, that means it can kind of accumulate in the tissues of the mussel and probably not be something that you want to eat. But of course, in a pinch, in a survival situation, sure, yeah, these mussels are totally edible and would be fine, but not something you probably want to go out of your way to look for. Now, interestingly enough, though, people, even in this century or even just a few years before, were looking for mussels in Kansas because they did have some other uses. A lot of them would be collected because you see the interiors of those shells often will be covered in a very pretty shiny nacre. That's Nacre, and they would that would be used for a lot of different things, whether it be for pearls or for buttons as well. This is you can see a mussel here that's been drilled for buttons, for those kind of mother of pearl looking buttons that were really common between like the 1890s and the 1950s. So that was a really useful way to get material for those buttons for clothing would be from mussels. So they used to be looking for them, collecting them, cultivating them used to be a pretty big trade. Not so much anymore because everything we have plastics and synthetics and things like that. But historically, mussels had a lot of uses beyond just food as well. Of course, even though people aren't really eating the freshwater mussels now as much either, that doesn't stop things like otters and raccoons or even turtles and coyotes and things like that from going after the occasional mussel. Could provide a helpful snack for them. So that's all I've got for our presentation today. I hope you learned a few things. If mussels are one of your favorite foods, maybe you have a new appreciation of them. And if you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about mussels, maybe you know a few things now that you didn't before. So thanks for joining me for the Lunch Bunch today, and we'll see you next time.